Okay, guys, April 13th. It's a beautiful Thursday here in Los Angeles. Certainly a beautiful day around the world for the global DevLake community. As always, we're meeting every other week. We're going to do our best to stay on that schedule. Now we're completed with all of our travels. Even though we do have some more coming up, we'll try and keep on a good rhythm. Today we have a really awesome session. One of our favorite members of the community, a friend, a partner, a user of DevLake, our friend Krishna Kumar. We connected with Krishna through one of our former interviews in a certain way, actually. So many of you might have tuned in for the interview with Nathan Harvey from the Google Cloud DORA team. One way or another, we connected with Krishna through the DORA community. We crossed paths there with him, as we have with so many other fantastic members of this universe, and immediately connected on all kinds of shared values and goals, right? This community of people who are looking to empower better engineering through the use of data, figuring out how to empower developers to do their best work, to live less stressful lives, to have more sustainable, effective practices using different kinds of metrics. All of it is this aligned vision. So I'm going to pass the mic in a second to our guest today. I'm also joined, of course, by my colleague, my collaborator, my friend, Hezhang Guillen, lead maintainer of DevLake. Hezhang will be part of today's discussion as well. We're going to have this great chat today talking about how to get DevData right, how to get DORA right, some of the shortcomings of some of these frameworks, some of the merits of them, ways to put them into practice, some examples that Krishna has seen on his fantastic career. So I'll pass the mic to Krishna to provide a brief introduction to himself, but I'd love to hear from you, Krishna. What are you focused on these days, at least for your kind of core focuses, and what was it that got you into this world of kind of dev data and data-driven engineering in the first place?
Awesome. Thanks, Max and Heshing, for having me on. I think I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So my background, I mean, I've been in this industry for a long time. I started developing software commercially in the early 90s. So that's like several centuries ago for you guys. But I did the kind of the usual thing. I went through engineering as an engineer, as an engineering leader, VP of engineering, CTO, and so on and so forth. And then about 10 years ago, I kind of went off on my own, just as a general kind of technologist, helping people sort of solve operational technical problems, kind of fractional CTO kind of work. And doing it from the outside, as opposed to doing from the inside, was just a very, very different game because you had to sort of get a sense of teams without necessarily working with them side by side every day, and so that's really the genesis of how I started. I was like, I need data. I need some way to understand. I don't have the ability to sit down and spend, write code alongside people, which is what I always did, right? So, and so he needed some way to abstract out this machinery to sort of understand, okay, well, what's happening on this team? How do I tell, right? Even if I cannot be there every day, right? And so I started getting sort of data into this process probably around like 2014, 2015. And then I quickly realized that changed how I practice my advisory work. All of a sudden, there was just like a different set of things you could bring to the table rather than just your opinions, right? Facts and data were very useful. It was very crude back then, but it was still very effective, right? And so then in the last about 4 or 5 years, I've really sort of changed I've really focused on solving problems with data, not just measuring data. So what do I need to actually understand the problems, make the case, that this is an issue that you need to look at, and bring data in at all points in the process. And so I ended up building some machinery, a platform and so on and so forth. And it's actually gotten pretty sophisticated, but it's a really sort of like, I focus on the data as an ends to the means to the end, not necessarily the data itself. And I still write code every day, and I have a very small team. We're still writing production code almost every day. And so it's pretty hands-on. So that's what I like. That's what I've been doing. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's one thing that just struck me about your background, even before we met and chatted for the first time, was you've really been thinking about these problems for quite some time, right? I think this trend that we're seeing of driven by things like DORA, I think for people like us, and probably people in our community even, we probably think that data-driven engineering is like Oh, everyone has done it for ages. Everyone knows it. Everyone, and as you very well know, like it's very much the opposite case where so few people have good grips on this. It's often new, even for the most impressive companies and most experienced and qualified leaders. So it really stood out to me when we met. I was like, wow, this guy has been way ahead of the curve. Has been thinking about data-driven engineering for many years, right? Long before it was this exciting thing, certainly long before there were these buzzwords, and long
Yeah.
before there were these frameworks. So I'm so thrilled
But I
to.
must say though, I think, having this become part of the mainstream conversation has been fantastic, right? So I think DORA, the guy stuff that you guys are doing, it's like a lot of the time when I was first starting out, this was like some kind of black art, right? Nobody trusted anything, you couldn't actually see, it was like some mysterious thing, right? But now that it's part of the conversation, I just think it's so much more healthy. There's so many more people talking about it. It's no longer okay, well, what is this nonsense you're doing, right? There's some discipline. There's a real discipline forming behind this, value streams and stuff, which we'll talk about, which I think is great. For me, that's to me, that's what makes my job easier. I don't have to convince people that what I'm doing is something mysterious, anymore. So
Awesome. Well, I think it leads comfortably into the first kind of discussion question I have for us to chat about as a trio here. So I think, of course, many people in our space, I think certainly it's true to say many in the DevLake community are very interested in DORA. DORA as a philosophy, DORA as a metrics framework. I think many people are using it as their foundation to get started with a fresh data-driven approach to delivering great software. And I think that's a great thing. So I have two questions for you, Krishna, to kind of steelman the framework a little bit, but also to, of course, get people even more up to speed with it, get them to understand it. I'm curious, how would you personally kind of articulate the value of the DORA metrics? Like, what makes them effective? What makes them a good framework? And then as the follow-on to that, I'd love to get your perspective on what are the risks or the potential shortcomings of the framework, and what should the newcomers really be mindful of as they get started using DORA?
sure. Yeah, I think those are great questions. So let's step back for a second, right? So you talked about the DORA program and the DORA metrics, and I think it's very important to understand that those two exist. Most of the time, people sort of conflate the two, right? If you think about DevOps and DORA as a whole program, it's really about how you improve the flow of value to customers, right? And I think that when you look at value and how you deliver value to customers, one of the things that you do in improving flow is you take out unnecessary delays in your process, right? And if you think about, when somebody's starting out, they haven't been measuring anything, they haven't been looking at improving process flow and so on and so forth. One of the first and the most kind of wasteful areas is kind of right at the tail end, right? When actual work is done and it's waiting around for being deployed to production because they have some kind of process that is either manual, it's either approvals, there's all sorts of risk about how you can get things into production, right? And so often if I were to look at a company that is just starting out they don't have necessarily a DevOps practice, or they don't necessarily know how to measure anything, that's usually the first place to start. I mean, that's your low-hanging fruit, because once you start thinking about how do I reduce the friction in getting work that's actually complete in the hands of customers, why is it sitting around, right? If you think about it that way, right, it's the biggest form of waste you can think of, right? So once you start down the process, okay, why can't I not get what I'm ready to ship to production today or as soon as possible, right? It unravels a lot of threads. And so DORA metrics are a good focusing mechanism for that. So it basically, the best way to think about this is in the overall flow of value, DORA metrics really tackle a huge portion of it, not all of it, is a huge portion of it, but it's often the most important thing to start with, right? So when you first start with this is a great place to sort of understand, okay, where are your shortcomings? So which is why, again, deployment frequency is the first metric that people often focus on, which is, if I have things sitting around that can be deployed, and you're waiting for a big batch deploy, why not just deploy faster, right? And once you ask the question, why cannot I deploy faster? You end up answering a lot more questions down the line. So it's more the sort of thinking process and the questions that you raise and the things you have to fix to deploy faster that are important, not measuring deployment frequency. If I'm deploying twice a month, once a month, then I don't need to measure my deployment frequency to know it's once a month, right? It's understanding that it's not good enough, and what do I need to change it, right? So the DORA metrics are at least as much a thinking framework as it is a measurement framework. Now, obviously, as you get more sophisticated about it, you do have to measure it, right? But the biggest value initially is kind of, why am I measuring these numbers and why does it matter? And to me, that is really about improving flow efficiency. And the first place that most important place and most wasteful place to start that is at the tail end, right? But it fits into a part of it's not sufficient. So that's kind of the other half. I just spoke for a long time, so I'll have you guys comment on that. So.
No, I think that's good. And one thing you said that really stands out to me, because I think it does kind of capture the essence of not just the theory, but the practice, is this idea that it's a focusing mechanism, right? And I think one thing that we see the great companies do a good job of, and maybe the bad ones do a bad job of, is that they use these things as a silver bullet, right? They're seeing it as like, here's the thing that tells us everything. And that's the bad way, right? And the most effective way for sure is the ones who are saying, hey, frontline engineers, hey, managers, hey, CTO, here's some data that can give you a more clear approach to focus on the right problems, the right challenges, have the right conversations in a more targeted way, let you kind of triage your problems. And this framework, more than anything, is just empowering you as the person, as the human in the loop, so to speak, right? To empower you to do the right thing at the right time. So I think that's really well said.
I mean, I see, one of the, if the DORA metrics are actually making their way to the C-suite, then you're doing something wrong, because it probably is the wrong focus, right? There's a lot of people who think of DORA metrics as productivity metrics, for instance. I mean, I think that's all pretty going down the wrong path, because if you think about the Accelerate and what they said about DORA metrics having a correlation with organizational performance, but it is really a correlation. It's based on surveys and so on and so forth, right? There is a lot more you have to do beyond improve your DORA metrics to actually improve value delivery. And so this is, again, I talk about value streams a lot, and I think value streams is where the real focus should be. So if you're at the C-suite, that's what you should be focusing on. Then DORA metrics are one thing that help you enable that. Very necessary, very important, right? But it's not the whole shebang. And for the most part, it may not be the right level of granularity to truly understand, the full scope of problems you have to solve to improve your value streams.
Exactly. And I think one of the magics of DORA metrics is that it get engineering department closer to the value stream, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a bridge between the engineers and the user values.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also the first, the real thing about DORA metrics is it is the first really credible set of engineering metrics. Right? We've had engineering metrics for the longest time, right? People talk about things and no engineer really believes in any of that shit, right? So they're like, it's stuff that you measure, but it has nothing to do with my day-to-day work. And DORA metrics really does. You can see the impact, on a day-to-day basis. As well as kind of higher up. So it's like, that's the beauty of DORA metrics in the framework, because it's the first real credible metrics that an engineer can look at and say, okay, well, that actually makes sense. I mean, I can see how improving that metric actually improves the value I deliver. Most of the other, metrics, even though I use a bunch of metrics like flow time, cycle time, they all seem very abstract and they don't really sort of affect how people work on a day-to-day basis. So the beauty of DORA metrics is really the first one that I could look at as an engineer and say, yeah, I can get behind that. I can see myself doing work to improve that, right? Because it makes sense. And I think that when it's because engineers are very skeptical about metrics, right? We don't, as a community, we don't believe that people can actually measure anything we do, right? So I think that and I fight with that all the time too, in the work I do. But I'm an engineer too, so I have these two sides to me. So I'm very skeptical, right? So when you actually look at metrics, you have to I always sort of think about, well, how do I actually sort of convince an engineer that it makes sense for them to actually make this work for them, right? And so it's DORA's metrics are the very first one I've seen, and that's why I was very excited when it came out, when Accelerated came out. It's like, yeah, finally, people are actually talking about metrics in a good way, so.
Absolutely. No, and it all makes a big difference. And I think in our first question here, we uncovered, I think, two really valuable takeaways, one from each of you, which is awesome, where a big part of the value of, I think, a good metrics framework in general, but certainly DORA is these two things, right? It's for our audience to kind of take away and think about for themselves is it is as much as anything a great thinking framework that can empower you to make the right decisions, focus on the right things, have the right conversations. And to Hezhong's point, all of this then empowers this approach to kind of eliminate some silos, foster better collaboration, find ways to interface with all of the different teams, find ways to articulate value, align value, kind of get things better connected to goals. All of that is the outcome that you're seeking. And if you're thinking of these metrics with that goal in mind, I think it helps make all of it so much easier to wrap your head around and so much easier to implement. So I'd love to.
Silver bullet, yes, not a silver bullet, like you said. As long as you understand that, it becomes very, very useful.
Exactly, and I'd love to move in to the next question I had for you, Krishna. So of course, for the audience that don't know too much about some of Krishna's work, one big part of that involves taking these kinds of data points and translating them into consultative engagements with companies looking to do something with this data. And I'm always curious of our users in the community, and certainly curious from your experience, Krishna. I imagine there's perhaps a constellation of goals or issues or pain points that you see when a company comes and knocks on your door. Maybe they're looking to either improve something or solve something, or maybe they've got an anxiety about something. I'm curious, what are the common things that you tend to see companies coming to you to see if they can solve it with metrics and solve it with these approaches?
So yeah, it's a very good question, right? And I think the vague anxiety is probably the biggest one, because in reality, most people who start down this process don't start out by saying we need to get metrics, we need to measure stuff to understand what's going on, right? For the most part, the people I work with are, typically it's unfortunately it's still mostly top down. So the people I'm talking to are mostly like C-level people, CEOs, CTOs, VPs of engineering, or bigger teams, have teams of maybe like, 50, 100, 200 engineers, and all of a sudden they can't see anything anymore. It's like it becomes hard to understand. We feel like we are slowing down, but we have no idea why, right? So it comes with a much bigger set of questions. And then, you then have to sort of understand. I usually introduce data in the context of solving those things. So if you say you feel like you're slowing down, well, let's figure out what that means, right? What does feeling like slowing down come down to, right? And then you try to translate those numbers into things that you should be looking at. Be very careful about how you look at them, right? Not because there's a lot of noise in this data, right? And sort of read between the lines. And when you actually give them an opinion of, okay, here's what I see that your issues are, then you actually have some data to back it up, and it's actionable, right? So I usually come to these problems from the other side, which is, okay, here's a problem. Let's figure out what data I need to understand what that problem is, right? And then we'll use the data to actually sort of know where to improve, and then build around. So I usually come exactly that. Nobody comes to me because they won't understand how to use data. It happens almost by, as a byproduct of the actual consultative process, and which I think is important, because I think that there are lots of, tools out there that give you metrics, right? And much harder problem is figuring out which metrics to apply right now in the context in your world that you're in right now. And why do I need to care about this metric? And it's very different for different companies at different stages, from different so on and so forth. So partly that's why I do what I do. I built my own platform because I had to sort of solve all these problems. I needed the data and so on and so forth. So I always work backwards from, okay, well, what is the problem? And it could be very vague. I don't know. I need to understand what is going on. And then turning that into something that's quantitative and measurable starts to then, and you get buy-in at that point. So you're not blindly following, okay, well, somebody told me to measure DORA metrics, so I'm going to use that. So that you never get into that situation. So.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And I'm curious, as a kind of follow-on to that, have you encountered any scenarios or questions where someone has come to you perhaps with a problem and they're saying, hey, look, I think we can use some of our data or get some analytics or metrics on this to solve, and you kind of push back on them to say, like, you know what, this is not a problem for metrics. This is, you're thinking of this the wrong way. I'm curious if there's any kind of high level challenges you've seen where metrics maybe are the wrong thing to focus on in the first place.
It's a good question. Quite honestly, I don't know that in the environment I work in, most of the time they don't have metrics to work with. So it's still, our world is still very very fuzzy and very qualitative. Most people don't have measurement systems in place that can even answer stuff. And if they're using, so I would say that using these kinds of, so I usually distinguish between system metrics and kind of qualitative survey data and things that you want to use to understand culture and stuff like that. When you see people use things like velocity and stuff like that for understanding productivity, and so those kinds of things, yeah, I usually push back pretty forcefully on that, because we all know that stuff doesn't really work, and it actually is quite harmful if you do them the wrong way, right? So yeah, I do see that kind of, I have a bunch of Jira metrics. I'm using this to understand how to get more capacity out of my team, and yeah, those things do happen. But often the people I work with don't have anything, which is good, because you can always start them off in a healthy way. People who think they have metrics are probably a bit more dangerous than the ones who don't have metrics, because at least you can get them started on the right path and kind of be careful. You have to be very careful in how you use this data, and it can do a lot of damage if you don't do it right. And so and like I have a very small practice. I'm still, I haven't had the kind of influence I need to actually really sort of say this is, that what I'm doing is becoming mainstream. But I think it's really in the scale I work at, I definitely try to make sure that you do the right thing, as opposed to and get them to the right outcomes, as opposed to some of the other things that are possible there. So
yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I agree too. It's an interesting point, and maybe an actionable one actually for our listeners. This point that starting with this blank canvas in many cases ends up being a better thing. And I certainly encourage anyone who's getting started on this for the first time to maybe some of the metrics you're using are good, right? We're not saying that, but I do invite you to consider this possibility that maybe you wipe the slate clean and maybe you start from scratch. And for us, certainly here at DevLake, we're big believers in DORA being a great starting point, right? And the key word there being starting point, right? You build this foundation, you build those practices of using data as part of your practice. You start going deeper, and then you start to focus on the right things. And I think, to Krishna's point too, it's always a vital consideration, and I'm sure most of you listening to this, being part of the DevLake community, already share this perspective, but it is a good reminder that things like kind of productivity measurements, right, tend not to be the right way to think about this in the first place, where it is truly impossible to account for all of the things that happen outside of the DevOps processes, outside of the repo, outside of the issue tracker, right? It doesn't account for having good planning meetings, having good problem-solving meetings, doing some good design sessions on a whiteboard, or having a meeting where you're maybe helping a colleague who's having a bad day or getting frustrated with something, jump on a half-hour Zoom call, help them out. Metrics are never, ever going to account for that. And all of those things are this patchwork quilt that make for great engineers, that make for great teams. So there's a lot of good reminders buried in that answer, for sure.
Yeah, and I should mention, like, one of the things I'm actually very excited about DevLake is because this machinery of measurements and so on and so forth has traditionally been top down, right? And again, it's largely the world I work in too, because just the way the world is right now, right? But it's top down, right? So you get metrics being imposed from the top down onto teams. Because the people who are interested in understanding this are managers, and they have a legitimate need to understand questions that are raised here, right? So the beauty of DevLake and an open source project like this is the fact that for the first time, if an engineering team just wants to do this, they don't have to go through purchasing. They don't have to get a contract signed. They can download the thing and start working with it, quickly, and nobody else has to even care about it until they're ready to talk about it, right? So I think the sort of stealth bottom-up adaptation of this stuff, I hope that's, and you guys have probably got more visibility, I just hope that's happening, because really the real change always happens bottom-up, right? You're not going to get the change top-down, right? Top-down, you need to sort of focus on the right things, but I always end up working with teams. That's where the real change happens, and they need to understand the data. They need to understand how to use it, right? And that's when real change happens. It's never, you need both top down and bottom up. And I think you guys are taking the friction out of that bottom up adoption almost better than anybody else I've seen so far, which is, again, I think that's a great thing, so.
Yeah, I love that you say that, because it's certainly been one of our goals, because we couldn't agree more. And we've made those mistakes in the past, right? Ourselves personally, and we've seen others do it, taking this kind of very top-down perspective. And I think exactly to your point, that's the magic of DevLake, is part of our vision for it, is being the tool that empowers the frontline people doing the frontline work to get started in adopting this stuff and build these practices, determine how they're going to measure things, determine how they're going to really define success and define objectives, bring that up the food chain, right? And then that becomes a great culture. It becomes great practices. It becomes one that empowers the engineers instead of, in my opinion, a top-down one being kind of like a surveillance, big brother, like
easily turn into that,
decided, right? So I love that point. I think it's so important and well stated.
Krishna, and you said one point that really struck me, which is, don't bring the metrics to your team and force those metrics onto your developers, but start with the problems that developers are experiencing, and then see what metrics can help solve their problem. One example you gave is, you said, one of the teams come to you and said, we feel that we are getting slower, but we don't know how and why. So I'm curious to dig deeper into that example. Is if a team comes to you with that question, what metrics would you help that team with to jumpstart them with?
Yeah. So the teams, again, I rarely have teams coming to me with a question, so I can't directly answer your question. It is usually more at the level of companies or engineering leaders coming to me that question, right? And so when you look at that, you're really looking at so the way I answer that question is first to figure out what is important for you to go faster versus slower, right? Rather than generally faster or slower. So it's typically around priorities. Some things we need to happen are not working fast, right? Going fast enough, right? So it comes back down to understanding your value streams, understanding kind of, how does your company actually deliver value, right? And why are those priorities no longer the way it is, right? So even before asking faster or slower, one of the first questions I ask is, because if you ask anybody, they want features, right? I mean, if you ask at the top level, we want new stuff going out the door, right? And typically the questions you can answer are things like, where is engineering capacity actually going, right? Do you even have capacity to build new features, or are you spending all of your time working on bugs because of technical debt? So you actually have to understand before you can say, okay, here's how fast you're going, here's the number. Obviously we have numbers like lead times and cycle times and so on and so forth. We have those metrics that can sort of quantify, speed, right? But without understanding the context of, what needs to go fast, what needs to go slow, right? Which value streams are you trying to support more efficiently? To what extent do your testing practices impact those, right? You almost start with all the root causes, sort of reasons why you think you're going to slow, right? And then come back to, okay, here's what slow means, right? There is no objective definition of slow or fast with our context of, what needs to be fast, what needs to be slow. And then, of course, we have our metrics. I mean, we can always measure, using ticket flow and commit flow, PR flows, and so on and so forth. We can attach numbers to those. But working backwards from the ways in which you can be slow, right? And the reasons for those, and trying to sort of isolate those, then you come back with, okay, here's why you think you're probably going slow, right? And here are some possible reasons, rather than saying, okay, here's your speed, right? Here's your speed is part of the conversation, but here's your speed is not where you start with, right? So you don't measure speed to understand how fast you're going, right? You understand why you might be going slow to understand, what slow means, right? So it's a little bit of there's a little bit subtlety in that, in answering that question. So I don't start with metrics. I come back with, okay, well, here are the possible reasons, right, why you might think you're going slow, right? And slow maybe I don't have time to build features because I'm spending all my time fixing bugs. Okay, well, you probably need to think about tech debt, right? So understanding slow and fast is a very, very kind of very nuanced issue, right? It's not about the number. It's not about the metric. No, that metric is part of the conversation, but it's definitely not the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and one we've actually seen, which is very exciting. Some of the best power users of DevLake really discovering the magic of is this notion of really kind of unifying and clarifying the vocabulary around these things, right? Because to Krishna's point there, maybe your CEO or maybe even your CTO is saying, hey, your teams are slow. And it's like, well, what does slow mean? Because we're actually really fast when it comes to bugs and tech debt. Maybe we're just slow in features. And maybe the reason for that is because we're managing these kind of upstream challenges, and it helps you to really define that, communicate it, and then translate it into action. I think that's such a great point. And
this is the value. This is where the value stream conversation comes in, right? Because I think ultimately, until you sort of take the if you look at the work that engineering does, right? Engineering can be working on a lot of different things, right? And we always have competing priorities. If you look at our pipeline, there's a ton of things to do, which are different levels of complexity, different levels of importance, right? If you don't have a clear way to understand and distinguish between which ones of those things are important and what the constraints are, the constraints for feature delivery might be very different from constraints for architectural change, right? And so value streams are the machinery that you use to actually sort of make the distinction between the why any piece of work sits in the pipeline, and if you actually start splitting the work up by value streams and analyzing all your metrics along value streams, then all of a sudden the numbers look very different. An average PR cycle time across everything you do is very different when you look at average PR cycle time of features, and that's often a small portion of the puzzle, right? So being able to sort of draw these finer grained distinctions and see value streams from end to end, then you see dependencies. Maybe there's a very particular dependency on a shared services team for doing certain kinds of work, but not certain other kinds of work, right? And that may be your priority at this point. So if you just look at this work as an undifferentiated mass of code changes and commits and work flowing through the pipeline, you often miss the forest for the trees. Which is again why, if you look at Gene Kim's, articles in the Unicorn Project and stuff like that, he always talks about the first way of DevOps is the system and understanding the value streams in the system. And you can use data to actually get those kinds of differentiation. And that's really why, when you can actually sort of segment the work, everything that's flowing through the system along value streams, it gives you so much more deeper insights into problems, and then you can actually solve them, in very different ways, in priorities and so on and so forth. So.
Absolutely. No, and I think it really touches upon one of the more crucial issues, in my opinion, of data-driven practices and data-driven engineering. This idea that we've seen so many people talk about this is, yes, they want to solve some of the kind of day-to-day challenges, but a big challenge that they've never found a way to really kind of effectively do is really kind of connect their work to these high-level business objectives. And I'd love to kind of double click on this, Krishna, because I think a lot of what you've said really kind of touches upon this. So I'd love to kind of ask you this question. I know you've talked a lot about value streams. Perhaps the first part of the question is, like, how would you define this notion of a value stream to someone who's never heard this phrase before. How would you define it? And then using that, like how would you work to kind of connect things like metrics to business objectives and kind of build this kind of bigger picture approach to things?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and you know, that's kind of my my specialty here. So I think I can happy to talk through that. So value streams in the abstract. So the main difference between value streams is and kind of just the flow of work in general, right? Is that you're always talking about a particular set of value propositions to a user or a customer, right? So you're always starting with a customer who has a particular set of problems among all the problems that you solve for them, right? And we're looking at kind of the flow of value in from end to end of all the work that's flow through your pipeline, relating to how you help them solve that problem. So examples of value streams might be new feature development as a value stream, right? So you want customers, if your product doesn't solve a problem for a customer right now, and you need to enhance that product, then that is basically a stream of work, right? Onboarding a customer may be a value stream, right? So you may actually have, because until you can onboard the customer, you don't really they don't get any value out of your product. So if you can build the tools and machinery in the process to make that faster, right? More efficient, more quickly, you generate value more quickly, right? So it's almost like a segmentation of, so if you look at it from the outside in, it's about how you provide value, different ways in which you help your customers, your product helps them solve and do a job for them, right? And improving, and you'll typically see, very stratified value streams in any product company. They do certain kinds of things. I need to help them with payments. I need to help them with configuration setup. I need to help them X, Y, Z. You can actually understand the sort of breakdown of those value streams, and they're long-lived, they're stable, they're associated with your overall value proposition, right? But from a data perspective, you can also stratify this by looking at, how you see where your touch points with your customers are and how the data flows through the system end to end, right? So I'll show you an example. I'll just put up a quick deck here, slide here, and I'll show you an example of a value stream and how the data can flow there, right? So this is a common example, we end up doing. And so if I look at this, you can see like this is a value stream that basically goes. So the value stream is called feature development, right? Typically, when you're looking at code commit data,
the slide just came off the screen. It was on there a second ago. Yeah.
Sorry, just give me a second here.
Real good. Yeah, we're seeing your blank canvas.
Okay, there you go. There's back. Okay, it's back now, right?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So if I look at the end-to-end process, right? Typically, the way I do this, and there are many people sort of solve this in different ways. Typically, from a data and measurement perspective, I look at the endpoints, right? So if you look at kind of the four phases of definition of the work, engineering of the work, shipping of the work, and how it actually runs in production, typically these different value streams have different kind of endpoints. So it may start from a road mapping system and end up measured outcomes being measured in a it's a user analytics tool. But typically you want to see the stream of work that goes all the way from definition, road mapping, all the way through production, and then potentially understanding impact and cycling and changing the cycle time of how long it takes you to get a measurement back from here to here, right? So that end-to-end measurement of the cycle is really how it lets you iterate faster on features. So you might actually speed this thing up really fast and still be bogged down over here because no one's measuring anything, right? So the value stream is really about understanding the cycle time to go from an idea to production and refinement. So it's a much bigger scope, right, in terms of what you measure, right? And it's also a much more complicated problem because you got to deal with the mess of ticket data, which is like really, really messy. There's a lot of work you have to do to sort of clean this data up, map things properly, integrate with multiple tools and so on and so forth. So a value stream kind of management is a bigger problem, of which, all the stuff we're doing, things like DevLake and so on and so forth, are very, very critical points in actually operationalizing this. But it lets you focus on, okay, if I want to improve my, my deployment frequency and pipeline and testing, because ultimately a lot of the time you cannot fix improve deployment frequencies because your testing is poor, right? And you cannot test everything. So where do you focus on? So we focus on the value streams where you really need to understand, where I need to improve my deployment frequency by improving testing, improving practices, focusing on value streams end to end. We should tell you where you want to speed up. You want to speed up this end to end cycle time. But what the value streams help you is which areas you really want to focus on, because you may just do a blanket mandate. You shall improve deployment frequency across the board, and that doesn't work right now because it's often very hard to do, right? But if I know that the changes I'm working on the most important value stream initiatives for my company, then it becomes much more easy to focus on end-to-end value, right? And then you say, okay, well, it's not enough just to fix this. You got to actually understand latencies here, requirements, and so on and so forth. You may have multitasking, too much work in progress. And this is the full DORA program. So if you actually look at the DORA website and look at everything in the DORA program, this is what it talks about, everything beyond the kind of the commit to deploy cycle and actually getting everything through the whole system aligned. And so this is the machinery you need to actually solve this. And it's not easy. It takes time. It takes a lot of focus. Again, this is why the consultative model works for this, because there's a lot of education, there's a lot of things you got to do. It takes time, but once you build this machinery inside a company, it's very, very powerful because it actually gives them both kind of end-to-end alignment and the ability to sort of operationalize that alignment. And so I've built my platform to do all of this, but it's not like you can't just plug it in. There's a lot of work. You can't just take it off the shelf and plug it in. There's a lot of work involved, and that's why I do my own thing, because I haven't seen other tools on the product that actually can handle the full scope of the problem. So, but it's it's a work in progress. Is that clear though? I mean, so I usually use the endpoints to understand how to split value streams. So, for instance, if this is coming from Salesforce, it's often a customer support problem, right? Because customers work with Salesforce. If it's coming from PagerDuty or on this side of the thing, you have Honeycomb as an observability platform, then it's usually an operational value stream. So so you pick the value streams, pick the starting points, clean up the data, and do end-to-end measurements very carefully. There's lots of things to be careful about here. But then you can actually get actionable data on things like feature cycle time, lead time, how often it takes you to deliver entire features as opposed to just tickets or commits or pull requests, right? And so it's a much more kind of it's a much more difficult problem to solve well, and it takes time and effort to do it. And so it's all part of the whole. So you kind of need and I'm quite honestly, I'm still learning how to do this. I mean, there's always new challenges every time I go to a new client, and we always figure out new things that we haven't considered before. I don't think many people are doing this end to end. So, but that's an interesting problem, and there's always interesting challenges to solve. Does that make sense though? I mean, does that make the difference between value stream thinking and kind of general flow of work thinking? Does that make sense?
It does. It does for sure. And I think one kind of high level concept that you touched on here, which I also really like because it's a universal challenge, is when I think a lot of metric strategies, a lot of data strategies are very much focused on the outcomes, which is naturally focusing on the outputs, right? And oftentimes can lose sight of the outputs are going to be heavily defined, heavily constrained by what those inputs are. Those inputs being the data sources, and the inputs being the questions you're asking, right? And
questions you're asking.
And I think value stream thinking, when you connect it to things like DevLake, all of these different metrics frameworks, and looking beyond the developer workflow, right, and looking into other key pieces of the puzzle, things like customer satisfaction, of course. That gives you this more clear map of what those inputs and outputs are, and subsequently is going to give you this greater capability to define them and then translate them into metric strategies and into actions. So exactly. I think this is a great way to just think about it and to make these big, hairy problems feel much more manageable.
And actionable, right? So segmenting along value streams brings so much more clarity around what you should actually be focusing on improving, right? So I think that it gives you the ability to prioritize, gives you alignment between kind of what the executives want and where the teams are working, and so the combination of top-down and bottom-up work really sort of becomes a reality when you actually everyone's focused on the same value streams to improve. And that's really the connection between kind of the alignment between people just doing improvement on their own and improvements that we know will impact the bottom line for the business. And that's it's important to do. I think not enough people do it. It's becoming more mainstream. I think a lot more people are talking about it. Mick Kirsten is talking about it a lot. I know that Gene Kim talks about it constantly. So it's becoming part of the scope of what we call DevOps. But I think that is the good thing. It needs to be there.
So there are 3 layers of metrics at the bottom of the slide, and I was wondering. So I really like this, pyramid of metrics, and I was wondering, what's your definition for first way and second way, and what's the difference between them?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So this actually comes from, it's not mine, it's basically Gene Kim's definition, right? So these are the 3 ways of DevOps. So there's an article that you can look at. He talks about it, and if you've read the Unicorn Project, that's a beautiful book that really sort of explains what these 3 ways are with real kind of stories and examples. So I think it's a great book to understand and read. But these are the 3 ways. The first is focus on the system, right? Improve flow through the whole system, right? Second is we're focused on amplifying feedback loops, right? And feedback loops can be everywhere. So if you look at, so the focusing on the system is basically looking at this whole thing, looking at value streams, like I said, but feedback loops can be everywhere. They can be here, feedback loops here, there's feedback loops in the pipelines, feedback loops from production, feedback loops from customers, and sort of improving the feedback loop on every one of these things reduces latencies, right? So latencies are the thing that kill you, right? Stuff just sitting around doing nothing, right? So DORA metrics really reduce latencies in this area, right? But the same principles apply everywhere. You can reduce latencies by reducing multitasking, by reducing the amount of work in progress you have. You can reduce latencies by collaborating quicker on requirements, having stuff lined up beforehand, and all those things show up in these metrics, right? So I think seeing the opportunities to reduce feedback cycles all through this process is really kind of the whole program. That's really, so DevOps is really sort of often thought of as sitting over here, but really DevOps is all through the process. It's making dev a part of the business, right? And making those 2 things the same, right? Priorities of dev are not contrary to the priorities of the business, and how do you actually sort of make everything align together, right? And looking at value streams is a way to understand kind of that end-to-end flow, right? When you just look at tickets or when you just look at commits or PRs, you don't have that context of what is more important and what's less important. So segmenting horizontally gives much more clarity around that. And then, of course, this is the most important one, right? So the third way, this is why I'm excited about things like DevLake, right? Experimentation, allocating time for improvement for daily work. This takes time. This takes work. It's not just, it doesn't happen just because you want it to happen. Taking risks, making some changes and seeing what happens. Don't expect, you have this stuff, flow, and it gives you the theory behind it. But when you actually try it out, you'll find that it doesn't always work because there are things that you have to sort of learn on how doing this made a change and it didn't or didn't. So experimentation, the kata model is very useful. There's a beautiful article called How to Transform. If you go to DORA.dev, has a beautiful article there, and really worth reading. This is what makes engineering a craft and a practice, not just grunt work of filling tickets, right? This is the stuff that's really exciting, and making what you guys are doing are helping democratize that, which is like, to me, the stuff that I do is not as easily scalable. It's not doesn't and making that bottom up is really the stuff that is exciting, and so all the best. I'm really very excited about what you guys are doing here. So
absolutely, no, and this is great stuff. And Krishna, if you're comfortable, I'll have to get copies of this to post in the Slack for others to take.
Totally, absolutely.
So for those of you listening live and listening to the recording, come to the DevLake Slack. You'll find these resources available to take a closer look at, because I think there's a lot of really great stuff cooked into what's being shared here. So this is fantastic. And I just pulled the screen down, being mindful of time. Would love to get into our final question, which is to kind of circle back to everything we've discussed here, Krishna. I feel like there's a lot of great advice, a lot of great concepts. I'm curious if you were chatting to a manager or maybe an engineering executive who's maybe looking to get started with data-driven engineering, what would be kind of your like maybe 2-minute advice to them? Like what should they make sure to get right? What are the things that they could get wrong that you'd want them to avoid? Like what would be your parting advice to someone looking to really dive into this?
It's a big question, but so I'll probably talk about the most important things. The first one is make sure you understand your goals, right? I think goals, this has to start with goals on what you're trying to improve, right? And then if you do use metrics, actually make sure that you can actually convince yourself that measuring these things will actually improve the goal. It's often not clear, right? They have a number, and then you look at this and say, well, that's supposed to improve. This number is supposed to improve Y, but why? Do you have a theory behind why? And so be careful about the metrics you use, because these proxies are often very inaccurate, right? And the third is bring your teams on board with the mission first before you talk about metrics. If you don't have the mission and the teams are not aligned on that mission, metrics are not the place to start the conversation, right? Once people understand, so if you figure out why the goals and the metrics align, and you can actually convince your teams of that as well, and the teams buy into that, then you're off to a good start, right? If you haven't done any of those and you say, well, here's a magic metric I'm going to measure, and this is going to tell me X, Y, Z, then you will end up with people trying to game stuff and just general distrust, right? So used in a healthy way, data and metrics can be a real power enabler of change in your organization. And just as while used in a bad way, it can really destroy the organization as well. And because it's destroyed organizations so often, more than it's helped organizations, it's got a bad rep, right? We all know this. I mean, it's an uphill fight, right? Trying to get people to work with healthy metrics and data. And it's only because it's been done badly for so long. And you got to acknowledge that, and engineers are skeptical for a real reason. It's not based on theory. It's not based on anything that is observable on the ground, so all the stuff you're doing now is actually starting to change that. And that what the DevOps Institute is doing, what DORA is doing, it's actually, there's some meat there. It's not just voodoo, right? There's some theory behind it, so I think being aware of all this stuff and being actually, if you've had a bad impression of what data can do as an engineer or as a manager, rethink those assumptions, because the world has changed, in the last 5-6 years. And it's, being aware of that, instead of knee-jerk not thinking about it. So those will be like I said, I have a lot of advice when it comes to this, but these will be the tough things. Do it in a healthy fashion. Think about how you can do this healthy, not just the objective measurement.
Yeah, I really like that, and I think it's perfectly said. And I think one part for me that I hadn't really thought about it this clearly before, that's one of my exciting takeaways from today, is also this idea of like, don't be afraid of the blank canvas, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like don't be afraid to knock it all down and start new. Like get DevLake started if you haven't already, and blow away all those metrics that are frustrating you and giving you no results, and start from a fresh point. Give yourselves that capability. I think that's such an exciting thought for sure.
And also use survey perceptual data. System data by itself is not enough. You need to understand context. So, you need to be talking to people on the ground. You need to be using non-system data to actually sort of also complement this, because a lot of the time people have information on the ground that won't get surfaced in this data, especially when we want to find root causes. You might see a symptom, but root causes mean that the people who are doing the work are the ones who know. So you want to complement both those things. They're not mutually exclusive, and they're not in tension with each other as well. Just more information, right, to make your decisions.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap it up, is just this great reminder that this stuff isn't necessarily going to be the fix, right? It's the tool to help diagnose. And I think when you think about it through that lens, it not only makes this stuff feel more practical, but I think it also then puts you into that right headspace of realizing that you're never going to be able to get this kind of magic complete picture.
It's always fuzzy. It's always fuzzy. Yeah, it's always fuzzy, right?
Exactly. And to close it out, one thought that I want to share with everyone listening live and to those tuning in for the recording is this wonderful philosophy that I think Krishna captures and Nathan Harvey really kind of got us tuned into in one of our previous interviews. And it's this idea, right, that these metrics-driven approaches become great practices that end up solving the right problems at the right times. But even more importantly, these practices, this approach to constant improvement and a culture of improvement, ends up having all of these positive side effects. And an analogy I like to kind of think about this through, right, is if your goal was to become a better tennis player, right, maybe one way to do that is to start doing squats to make your legs stronger, or maybe start doing a certain weight lift to make your arms stronger. But your goal isn't to become the strongest squatter or the strongest, bicep curler, right? That's just a part of the practice to get to your goal of being a great tennis player. And if your goal is to become a great engineering organization, these things help you map, using this silly metaphor or analogy, right? These things help you map that, right? It helps you show what are the exercises you should be doing, that if you focus on those with that big picture in mind, with that outcome in mind, you'll just suddenly find yourself becoming that better tennis player, or in our case, a better engineering organization.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes work, it takes practice. It's not something that happens while everything else happens. It takes focus. So absolutely, amen to that.
Fabulous.
These are great parting thoughts, guys. And I feel we've only got a sneak peek of your wisdom, Krishna, applying metrics on the field. So we'll have to invite you back to our community meetup and do another episode pretty soon. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Exactly. No, I'm so grateful for your time today, Krishna. Grateful to everyone tuning in. Thankful to our community for being the heart and soul of DevLake. This was a really fantastic session. As always, we'll be sharing this recording in due course. You'll be able to find it first in the Slack, as always, via the Apache DevLake YouTube channel. Krishna's, of course, in the Slack community. So we encourage you to send him a DM to thank him for his time today, and we'll be sharing those resources that we've discussed today, in addition to a summary blog, which our colleague Joshua will be sharing next week. So I think with that,
feel free to reach out to me on with questions and stuff too. Yeah, I'm happy to help in any way I can. So
we really appreciate that. Well, fabulous. Well, that concludes today's session, gang. As always, thanks for tuning in. We'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. And Krishna, thanks again for being such a great part of the DevLake community.
Thank you so much for inviting me. A pleasure.
All right. Bye for now, guys.
Bye.
See you guys.